Awesome. Okay, good morning, everyone, and happy Valentine's Day. My name's SJ. I'm Communications Manager with Commission Shift, and we are coming to you in a slightly different format than we've done. So this is our first sort of video debrief. We have been doing these sort of staff debriefs in the past using Twitter Spaces or X Spaces. And we were doing them with the open meeting that the Railroad Commission was having. We would sort of watch the open meeting and then discuss what happened in that open meeting, kind of give highlights and recaps in our Twitter space. And as some of you in this meeting space already know, some of you may not know, the Railroad Commission had a meeting scheduled for today, which they ended up canceling. But we decided, hey, we, have the space. It's the anniversary of Winter Storm Uri, which is very significant here in the state of Texas. So let's use this space to kind of reflect on this anniversary and what the Railroad Commission, what their role is in that devastating state tragedy that we had in 2021, sort of reflect on the Railroad Commission's role, what they've done since then, what they still need to do, and how we're engaging with them in general, and how they are being accountable to the public and how we can hold them to better accountable standards. So that's what this space is, and it's really time for us to connect and kind of talk about those things. So thanks for everyone for joining. To kick it off, I know our Deputy Director, Dr. Maria Reyes, had prepared comments to deliver to the Railroad Commission today about Winter Storm Uri. And we thought it would be appropriate to let her read those comments that she would have given if the meeting hadn't been canceled. So I'm going to pass it to Dr. Reyes to share those comments with us.
Hello. I hope you guys can hear me. I've been having issues with technology today. So today is Valentine's Day, and I'm not gonna read comments. I'm gonna try to engage in a conversation around the theme that has to do with Valentine's Day and what it means to each one of us. So in Mexico, for example, we celebrate a day of love and friendship. And I believe that these types of themes kind of bring to our attention the type of relationships we have and what we consider a good relationship and a bad relationship. And Storm Uri, the anniversary of Storm Uri, brings to mind not only big devastation, death, and possibility that we are not managing our energy correctly. And most importantly, the relationship we have as citizens with the agency that is regulating this sector of our lives. And so I would like to just bring some facts about the storm that are going to ground us into this discussion. So for example, there were $6.5 billion that were securitized. And what that means is that it's a debt that was kind of brought about because of bad management practices and failures along the electric grid that were not only failures of demand. However, that was the language used. The language used was that we citizens or we customers, and that includes industrial customers, that we use so much electricity that we kind of made the electric grid fail. And so that facilitated this argument that because we demanded too much, then it was our responsibility to pay this debt. In addition, the failures were not new. Okay, looking back at the history in Texas, there has been storms in 2011, 2014, 2018 that kind of hinted in the past at the fact that we have issues having to do with this. And so it wasn't anything new. But the most important aspect of this is that it brings to mind the idea of sustainability. What are we doing to sustain our energy grid? And also, what kind of relationship do we have with agencies that regulate this that will allow for that long-term sustainability? Because one of the aspects that we need to keep in mind is that Storm Uri is a side effect of our weather experiencing extreme changes. And this is going to continue to happen, and maybe not just in the cold side, because actually those are going to be reduced, is going to increase in the heat side. So it is important to know that, for example, the Texas Authority on Weather, and they do this analysis in Texas A&M, they're letting us know that by 2026, there is going to be a 40% increase on days over 100-degree weather. And I want you to consider this, okay? Because in 2023, the average temperature in the state of Texas was 85.5 degrees Fahrenheit. And in Austin, for example, they experienced 40 consecutive days of over 105 degrees. In Laredo down here where I am, we experience heat a lot, and we experience over 59 consecutive days of over 105 degrees. And then in places like Austin, they experience 44 days of over 105 degrees. Now, just thinking a little bit about this, okay? These types of increasing weather, changes in weather, are going to put a high burden into the electric grid. Now imagine you are experiencing these, they are passing the cost to you of these experiences, of this extreme weather, of the burden that is being put in our electric grid because of demand and because of failure in management and maintenance of equipment. And we're going to continue paying, these things. But then on top of that, the agencies that regulate do not allow us to speak. And this is where that relationship concept comes in. What are we allowed to say in order for us to be able to have a say in this sustainability? How are we going to survive the future if silence is imposed upon us? And the only ones that are able to talk is the industry. And then the industry only adds the cost and the burden to the customer. So that's where I want to lead this. It's very important to take this opportunity in the anniversary of Uri and start thinking in terms of longevity, sustainability, survivability. Those are things that we need to start thinking about.
Thanks, Dr. Reyes. Yeah, I'm hearing things are going to get, extreme weather is going to get more and more common. It's going to be the new normal from what you're saying. And if we want to have a functional relationship with our state agency, we have to step up and, make them communicate with us. And that sounds like the sort of theme that we're looking at today. It's Uri meets Valentine's Day. It's statewide grid regulation oversight meets healthy communication and harmonious relationships. So thank you for setting that stage for us. Our executive director, Virginia Palacios, is also here. I want to give Virginia a moment too to kind of speak and maybe reflect as well on some of what Dr. Reyes has shared.
Thanks, SJ, and thanks, Dr. Reyes, for your remarks. I think it's just important for us to remember that Winter Storm Uri was the costliest natural disaster that we've had in state history so far. and that hundreds of people died in this event. It was also the largest carbon monoxide poisoning event in state history. The consequences were significant. It came at a very difficult time. This was still the pandemic, and so people had a lot of pressures that they were dealing with as a result of the pandemic and being in lockdown. And so, I think one of the things that stands out for me is this structure of campaign finance and personal financial interests that we have in the state, where the railroad commissioners are allowed to have a financial interest in the same companies that they're making a decision about. And although they're supposed to recuse themselves, we never have seen the railroad commissioners recuse themselves for decisions they've made about companies they have an interest in. They're also allowed to make decisions about companies that donate to their campaigns. And, CEOs of companies can donate any amount to the railroad commissioners at any time of year. Maria mentioned that we've seen blackouts like this before. Certainly none had as fatal of consequences in our past as Winter Storm Uri did. But in 2011, Texas had a significant blackout event that about 4 million customers lost electricity service in 2011 as a result of the winter storm. In contrast, Winter Storm Uri in 2021, about 4.5 million customers lost energy. So it was similar in the number of people who were affected. But in 2011, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission suggested that the Railroad Commission consider rules to weatherize the natural gas supply chain. And the state decided to do nothing. The Railroad Commission decided to do nothing, presumably because some companies just didn't want more rules. And when you have a decision-making structure where there are financial interests directly influencing those decision makers, and there aren't a lot of guardrails put up with that, there's an extremely high potential for biased decision-making. And I think with Winter Storm Uri, that potential for bias could have led to a lot of these fatalities that we saw. And so it's important for us to be aware of that. I think, first of all, most people don't know that the Railroad Commission is really our state oil and gas agency and that they have nothing to do with railroads. But it's really important to be aware of the conflicts of interest that we have allowed to persist in this structure. And that is something that we can change by talking to our state legislators and by asking the railroad commissioners to do better when it comes to recusing themselves. I think the other thing that I want folks to know on this anniversary is that, the public did show up and testify and comment after Winter Storm Uri during the legislative session. There were thousands of comments submitted to the legislature. People showed that they were watching when all of these discussions were taking place during the legislative session. And we got weatherization into SB 3. That was the big energy restructuring bill that passed in 2021. And then the Railroad Commission had to pass a rulemaking to implement those weatherization standards that were passed for the natural gas supply chain. In the first draft of rules that we saw come out from the Railroad Commission, they were pretty weak. There were a lot of holes in those rules and a lot of loopholes that companies could have gotten away with doing practically nothing. And we saw over 900 people comment on that Railroad Commission rulemaking. I mean, that I don't think has ever happened before. And so we ended up with much stronger rules as a result. And so I just want people to know that, because I think, there is a lot of doom and gloom in state policymaking, and, we do have these bias structures that we need to reform. But it's also important to know that when the public turns out and participates in government, we get a better product as a result, and we get more safety. And so with that, I'll pass it back to you, SJ. Thanks.
Thank you. And thanks for ending on the positive note, because I do think that's really important to emphasize, is that there are pathways, and that when we do participate, we can see outcomes that are favorable. So I'm really, yeah, happy to sort of hear that and remember that, and use that as a reminder as we move forward with like other things that we want to see, other changes at the Railroad Commission, and the policies that they are making decisions on. And so another thing that kind of came out of this Railroad Commission open meeting that was canceled was sort of a reflection on what are they doing with these open meetings? How are they serving the public or not serving the public? And so I think that it's worth like turning our attention to that as well. So while we're talking about, you know, the rules that they have enacted that have improved potentially our grid reliability with weatherizing, you know, are there other rules with public engagement that we can kind of identify and advocate for? And so this is an ongoing discussion. Our organizing director, Marta Valadez, has been sort of giving us a lot of inspiration and a lot of thoughts and ideas. And so I want to also create space for Marta to share what you've observed, you know, in your time coming into commission shift with this open meeting getting canceled this month, sort of what you're noticing and what you would like to see at the Railroad Commission.
Yeah, totally. Hi again, folks. I'm Marta Valadez, or Mars in English. I'm first wanting, before we jump into anything, say thank you for everybody who's put the labor in creating this really awesome space for discourse, dialogue, reflection, and community building. And to everyone who's here, I think I'm really approaching this as like a conversation and reflection space to be able to build together for the work ahead for the year. So I'm really grateful. It's been a month of orientation and onboarding and just a lot of excitement to know that like we're part of a really strong team at Commission Shift and a network that I know we're going to be able to do some really awesome work and build our collective power to really realize the change that we want to see on the Railroad Commission and in our communities to really protect people and our environment. So I think one thing I wanted to kind of start off with is like really thinking about and reflecting on like what is that the highlights and takeaways what we're observing from this last, you know, meeting cancellation. And it's really specifically looking at like what we're talking about when we talk about democracy, and protecting and defending democracy in our country and in our state. And for me, it really comes down to the fundamentals of like decision making, right? That is what democracy is about, is like having space to say and have a say about how decision making is made on issues that are impacting our lives on the daily, right? And it comes down to governance, like governance and authority over how decisions are made on those issues that are impacting our communities, our families every single day. And I think the illustration and the grounding that Maria and Dr. Reyes got opened up with, I think it was very powerful and helpful to remind us of like what is at stake here. And so like I think fundamentally the question around governance, the structures of what is creating the governing process for the Railroad Commission is the key question here. And are we interrogating the way that decision making and who is making decision making at the table is considering people over profit, right? And who are they making decisions? How are these decisions? Who's benefiting from the decision making that's happening at that table? And are we truly being heard, or is it a performance to be heard when we're talking about public comment and our, you know, points of view as folks who are directly impacted, right? And I think like thinking about strategy of like how we can arrive at that table with the power to assess and analyze how we're being heard and how we're not being heard when it comes to decision making. So I think that's like the most important thing to think about is like what are the, you know, I'm curious to hear from folks as well if you want to drop it in the chat, is like what does, you know, healthy decision making and governance look like? What can we imagine it to look like? And are we you know, fundamentally thinking about how we protect the right to directly and democratically meet the needs of the people, and be able to like have and create organizing opportunities to be able to make decisions before we even arrive at that table with our collective power, right? So yeah, that's kind of just like I think a quick note on what I think like we should be like thinking about in terms of what democracy looks like in our respective organizing spaces, and also when we arrive to like structured governing tables that are like people that we're putting into that are elected into those decision-making tables.
Thanks. Yeah, I appreciate Virginia dropped in the chat that question of what does healthy decision making and governance look like to you, and thinking about examples of that. Marta, I'm wondering if you can give us some examples at the Railroad Commission, places we've identified that they could be more in dialogue with the public.
Yeah, I think when we're talking about like solutions or ideas, it's really about the fundamentals of like what democracy is. Really requires a bigger assessment of like challenges and barriers for people to actually participate in democracy, and that like we can't just say, oh, simply there's a monthly meeting and you can show up in Austin and give your opinion or your point of view, that like folks are going to be able to arrive at that opportunity. So like we cannot ignore economic inequalities or institutional barriers or historical context around how and what is limiting people's opportunity to be able to show up. So like knowing that we're experts of our own communities and how we see those challenges happening every single day, we can think about like just the pure like solution or idea around accessibility. Like we've learned a lot from the pandemic, and a lot of governing agencies have moved in stride with like what has become a virtual like world of engagement, and using like we're using now the tools like Zoom, and being able to have people be able to participate in the democratic process through the virtual world, right? Because not everybody has the privilege to be able to pay for a ticket to get out to Austin to have their voice heard, and let alone when they do purchase a ticket and a meeting like this one in February that was supposed to happen today is canceled, they're not able to get their refund, right? Or just make an adjustment to their schedule, take time off, right? We have to keep a lot of those barriers in mind. So that is like one of the main takeaways that I was sitting with, is that challenge around like, if this is the only platform for democracy and it's so inconvenient and inaccessible, how is this true democracy? How are we practicing and creating true pathways for democracy and public input on a very major issue that is impacting so many people's lives across the state? Not even if they're just directly residing where oil and gas industry is having their business, but also folks who are we just talked about all directly impacted by climate change. So yeah, I think that is one powerful thing, that basic, right, that we can try to think about how to transform. And I know that one of our other platforms that we're going to talk about is language justice, so I don't want to go into that because I think Jose can say more as an expert around the right to have language access in the way that we do governance in our state and in our country. So I don't know if that kind of answers your question, but if I could say more, let me know.
No, that does. And I think that is something that we have to keep, bringing up and fighting for, which is that virtual option for open meetings. And at the same time, getting the railroad commissioners out of Austin and visiting these sites and making meetings happen in other places around the state. It is no news to anyone that Texas is a huge state. So to pretend that you can have a meeting once a month in Austin on a weekday morning for 30 minutes and call that an open meeting is really a mislabeling of what that is. It's not truly open. as you pointed out very well, for so many reasons. And one of not just physical accessibility, but language accessibility. So I do think we should talk about that. There was a really great question in the chat, though, that we could get into now. Maybe we'll save it to the end, but I just want to highlight, New Mexico, this comparison to New Mexico and their oil and gas regulation versus Texas's. So just putting a pin there if there's any lessons we can draw from that comparison. But yes, language accessibility is another piece of this that we are seeing, at the Railroad Commission. It could be improved. And I think Jose is, the person we want to turn to here. So Jose is one of our program coordinators, and you've given public comment before at these open meetings, Jose. Could you speak to what that experience was like? What was your perspective of what you noticed giving public comment and giving it bilingually and in Spanish, what that experience was like?
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. This is my first time participating on a Zoom meeting, so bear with me. Yes, I would say I was very disappointed that I was not able to have an interpreter, right? It was very disappointing. There's a lot of people like myself that do struggle to speak, English, and unfortunately, the Texas Railroad Commission does not provide interpreters. When I got when I registered to provide the public input, I did request an interpreter because I do struggle, and they didn't responded back that they didn't have one or anything when the time to show up for that open meeting. I got there and I was looking for somebody to guide me as far like, where's the interpreter? So when I finally found somebody there and I asked, I did request that an interpreter to be here to help me out, and to interpret what I wanted to say to the commissioners. And they told me that they didn't provide one, and that I needed it to bring my own. So this is very disappointed. We need to have language access, right? And this is going back to what Marte was talking about out of democracy, right? We're not seeing that being part in there.
And Jose, how do you think the Railroad Commission's that experience of them not providing interpretation, they're not working with you, you had to find that yourself. How do you think that impacts Spanish-speaking community members who are impacted by oil and gas development?
Well, I mean, the first thing, this forces the limited English proficient communities to fund their interpreters, which in many times it leads to misinterpretation and misinformation, right? Because most of the people that we usually look for are friends or family members, which are not qualified interpreters. It also excludes these communities from full access to civic engagement, right? It fails to make them part of the decision-making process and deprive them from access to environmental justice. Other things that we have seen is usually we get negative decision-making that has an impact on their health and the economy, and they make them basically powerless to fight back environmental injustices. Just to name a few, I think the lack of access should be viewed like we're going back again with what Marte was saying, should be viewed as a threat to our democracy and actually to our civil rights, because it deprives the community from expressing their own opinions or concerns in a language our community can read, speak, and understand.
Thanks. And are there examples you've identified of things the Railroad Commission could be doing? Are there federal guidelines for language accessibility, or even state guidelines about like a state agency like the Railroad Commission that they should be adopting and implementing?
Well, the first thing I would like to see from the Railroad Commission, we'll see what happens. I would like to love to see the Railroad Commission come up with a good language access plan, right? There's been some executive orders out there. There's the one executive order, 13166, right, which requires most federal agencies to provide a language access plan. Oh, okay, let me get closer. Uh, so yes, I would love to see the Rebel Commission come up with a language access plan. We we don't know yet. We're also looking into see what are those federal agencies that have some sort of jurisdiction over the Texas Rebel Commission that would probably enforce some of those language that would require to enforce like Title 6 civil rights within the agency, right? We already know that the EPA has some obligations to enforce Title 6, right, which protects uh, language based on national origin. So we're looking into that. The other thing we need to see, we will have to see the Rubber Commission improve their website. It's basically all in English. We've seen very little, a couple of maybe documents translated. We need to see more, like when it gets to policy making, right? We want to make sure that people that do not understand English are able to understand what's going on with policy making, so they can have an opportunity to voice out, right, and voice out their concerns about what's going on with those policies within their communities. We also would like to see the Texas Railroad Commission uh, to start doing more with community outreach, right? Not only in English, but outreach in Spanish as well. We have seen the EPA doing a better job. We have seen the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality doing that. And we just learned that one of the reasons the TCQ is providing the language because they were sued for non-compliance, right, for non-compliance with the Title 6. So this is the reason they are not providing. I think this happened just last year. So I think for now, I think we need the Texas Railroad Commission to be doing more on outreach as well. Go out there and speak the language those communities can actually speak, read, and understand. And I think another thing we should be focusing in. We know we learned a lot uh, during the pandemic, right? We know that we can work remotely. We also need to have those open meetings be like remotely, right? We need with technology that we have now, like we're doing right now. We have the Zoom meetings. We can do Google meetings, right? We also need to provide that open space for that community to voice out, right? Because we're not seeing there's a lot of environmental injustices going on in those communities. Because we gotta remember that those communities that are most impacted by the oil and gas industry are those communities that live very close to where the oil and gas, production is happening, right? And most of those communities are basically underrepresented and underserved. So yes, we definitely need to open those spaces for to basically get the desire to be a more democratic state, right? Because right now we're disenfranchising those communities, right? Because we're not giving them the opportunity to voice out in a language they can speak, right? Or even read or understand. So yeah, we can do a lot. The Texas Railroad Commission can do a lot as far as like public engagement, their website. But I would love to see them actually come up with a good language access plan.
Thank you. Thanks for identifying those areas. It is a lot. And we're pushing in all these ways and identifying these avenues that we do want to put pressure on the Railroad Commission to see these changes. So thank you for outlining some of those. There's some questions in the chat. Do we want to talk a little bit about some of these questions? If anyone, Virginia, Dr. Reyes, about first the New Mexico question.
Sure, I can answer some of those questions. So yeah, New Mexico does have some rules on methane that we do not have in Texas. There's been a big effort there for a long time, and you know, what will it take for Texas to get similar regulations? You know, I'm not sure about that. Like, I think some of it is probably political. You know, they're also a different state. The population is different. The voting history is different. But I think, you know, here in Texas, like we certainly are pushing for stronger methane standards, but we see the Railroad Commission, they just voted last month at their last open meeting to join a lawsuit with the Texas Attorney General to oppose the EPA's methane standards. And so, you know, I think it's interesting because actually in New Mexico, oil and gas makes up a greater portion of their state revenue and their state budget than in Texas. In Texas, oil and gas, you know, fees and things like that are only about 3% of our state revenue. So it's not as dire for us to, you know, pass common sense regulations that might impact a portion of the oil and natural gas sector. And then there was some questions about Beamer Lake. That's a 60-acre saltwater lake in Pecos County that has radionuclides, high levels of hydrogen sulfide coming from it. The issue with that lake is that there are wells that were permitted by the Railroad Commission as oil and gas wells, and then were transferred to the landowner for use as water wells. The modern form that's used to do this is the form P13, and so sometimes these types of wells are referred to as P13 wells, although that form didn't exist back when those wells were drilled. And so, you know, state law clearly states that, you know, an orphaned well is under the Railroad Commission's authority or jurisdiction to plug if the well has been inactive for at least 12 months and if there's no operator on file with the commission, and if the well was originally permitted by the Railroad Commission. It doesn't have to be an operating oil and gas well. But the Railroad Commission has been saying that because these wells were transferred to the landowner as water wells, that they're not oil and gas wells, and that means they're not orphaned wells. But that's not stated anywhere in state law or even in the Railroad Commission rules that the wells have to be oil and gas wells. And so there's an existing formal complaint with the Middle Pecos Groundwater Conservation District, and they're going through this formal hearings process with the Railroad Commission to kind of press issues like these with those P13 water wells. And I think that answers some of the questions. There's a question about how much it'll cost to clean up Beamer Lake. I haven't seen a formal estimate yet, but some of the ballpark figures people have thrown around are about $50 million. And whether the other question is whether this should be requested as a line item in the next legislative session. Yeah, I think that's kind of like fair game. My understanding is that the Legislative Budget Board is going to be meeting about agencies and their budgets sometime this month and next month. And so, you know, these are things that are being discussed right now. Let's see. Okay, and then the next question is the Railroad Commission under the state's authority or under the federal government? And which organization under the state or the feds have oversight and funding? So at the federal level, most of the rules that the Railroad Commission is tasked with overseeing are coming from the Environmental Protection Agency, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. And so that's rules that pertain to groundwater contamination. A lot of oil and gas activities that create air pollution are regulated by the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. And then when it comes to pipelines and natural gas pipeline safety or hazardous liquid pipeline safety, the federal agency that's responsible is called the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration. The acronym is PHMSA, and they're under the U.S. Department of Transportation. And so a lot of the rules that come in through PHMSA, the Railroad Commission actually implements on the ground. And so they're tracking pipeline leaks and explosions and things like that, and monitoring for safety. And they have certain rules that operators follow under the Railroad Commission. And then when it comes to funding, there is certain federal funding that's coming in for plugging orphaned wells, for example. There's also a new rural gathering pipeline rule. And so the Railroad Commission is getting some funding from the federal government to implement that rule. Most of the Railroad Commission's funding actually does come from the oil and gas industry. And so they charge fees for oil and gas operators to file paperwork with the Railroad Commission. Sometimes there's penalties that the Railroad Commission collects as revenue. There's other little taxes and surcharges here and there, and all of that funds the Railroad Commission, including the orphaned well plugging program. However, now that the Railroad Commission is receiving federal funds to plug some orphaned wells, you could say that those federal dollars are essentially taxpayer dollars. I think those are all the questions that I see in the chat. Back to you, SJ.
For the rapid fire answers, Virginia. And so complete and detailed. So thank you. Marta, I want to circle back to this Lake Beamer question, because I think, could you give us maybe an organizing lens on what to do about Lake Beamer from an organizing perspective?
Yeah, I think like Commission Shift has created the powerful multi-pronged like strategy from like policy lens, from like, you know, the advocacy lens, and from the grassroots organizing perspective. And so I think it's always coming back to the fundamentals of like, what is the theory of change on how we think we can like win on the demands that we're trying, or the proposals or recommendations we're trying to make to the Railroad Commission. And so I think like the fundamental is like, power is either like, from organizing many different perspectives, like power is about money and people. And so like movement, it's fundamental that we build people power, that we create capacity of people in the communities that are directly impacted and across the state for folks who, you know, have to make a voice and create a network of leaders and organizers across the state to be able to be informed about what's happening, be informed about how they can have, how we see the interventions, and be able to add that, you know, duplication of our energy and our capacity and our voice. That's going to be the way we do it. And so like strategies around the old school way of like door knocking, having a house meeting, like, you know, having a press conference, like any and all the creative and fun, joyful, like culturally competent ways we can build strategies and tactics for the long haul. Like this is a tough fight, right? That's what we need to start thinking about, is like, what is in our own power? Who do we know in our own networks to be able to bring along into this fight, this campaign, right? This awareness and also organizing campaign, right? That we have something tangible we want to see that we know can change this. Here's the recommendations that we know, we can all concretely say it. And like, we are constituents to these folks who are elected, right? And that they have decision-making authority, but they're accountable to us. So I think just thinking through how we do that, how do we center the most directly impacted folks, and how do we create the network and the space and the structures to be able to organize people power is the way we're going to be able to win. I don't know specifically for Beamer Lake, right? I'm still getting oriented, but my gut is always goes back to organizing fundamentals. Who are you talking to? How are we building grassroots and grass tops organizing through just everyday people to informal and formal institutions, churches, you know, community groups, nonprofits that are in our network? We have to be able to map that out and organize to build that collective power.
Awesome. On that note, I want to take that energy and maybe turn it back to the Railroad Commission open meetings, and maybe throw it out to the group. Feel free to come off mute or use the chat, whichever you prefer. But how can we show up to these open meetings every month? How can we engage with them in a way that, you know, we can make our needs known and have them be met, to use the language of relationships again that Dr. Ray has shared with us at the beginning? Like, how can we use that space more effectively to rally around, to organize around, to show up for, to engage with? What are our ideas for 2024 with the open meeting? And on that note, I'm going to take the recording off so we can chat a little more freely. And before the recording goes off, follow us at Commission Shift. We're on most social channels. Our website, commissionshift.org, has a lot of resources and reports, policy recommendations, and we'll be back talking at the next open meeting on March 19th as well, the Railroad Commission open meeting at that time. All right, I'm going to take us off our recording.